So we'll introduce our speaker. This is Abby Saeed. She's been with MSU Extension for three now. And so she's our horticulture specialist out at Bozeman on campus. And so she wrote a really good article that I read in one of our publications. So I thought that'd be a good topic to cover. So we'll give the floor to Abby, and I guess that's it.
Yeah, thanks, Ben, and thanks for inviting me. Pollinators are my favorite topic to talk about, so when Ben mentioned that that's what he wanted me to talk about, I was really excited. I did my master's at the University of Kentucky and worked on native bees, and now I'm working on my PhD at MSU on native bees as well. And so I'm looking forward to learning more about Montana's bees as we go. So why should we care about pollinators? That's pretty easy for people who like gardens and people who are out and about with flowers, but pollinators are pretty important to us. They provide a lot of services. So in terms of food on our tables, you've probably seen this image of what your produce section would look like with bees versus without bees. And it would be a pretty dramatic shift in the things that we would have available to us in terms of food if we didn't have our bees around. And then on top of that, they're economically very important. So over $20 billion annually is provided to us by pollinators to our agricultural operations. And of those, about $3 billion a year is from native bees specifically. And so they have a lot of kind of pollination services that are often overlooked, as opposed to honeybees, which are often focused on. And they also provide food for our wildlife and all the other kind of organisms that share a space with us. They help fertilize plants, which means native plant biodiversity. And so they're an important part of the ecosystem surrounding us. So pollination is really cool. It's a symbiosis, which means two organisms that are relying on each other. And in the case of pollinators, most of these are mutualisms, which means both of these organisms are getting some sort of a benefit. And in this case, the pollinator gets food out of the equation, nectar, pollen, other plant products, and the plant increases its likelihood to successfully reproduce and create seeds and create new plants as a result. So in the past, what's happened is what we've seen as plants diversified in the number of species that we've seen. We've also seen a diversification in the number of insect species, especially those that are pollinator species. So as we saw the number of species of plants increase, the number of species of bees, butterflies and moths, flies also started to increase, and they collaborated pretty closely with each other. So flowers will cater to their pollinators, which means that flowers that are pollinated by certain groups of insects have features that make them easier or more user-friendly for those insects. So flowers that are pollinated by bees often have interesting markings. So that yellow flower is what you would see. And then on the right-hand side is what a bee would see. And these flowers have these markings called nectar guides, which are only able to be seen through the UV spectrum. And bees will land on that petal and follow that marking all the way down to the source of nectar, so she'll know where to go. Flowers that are pollinated by hummingbirds and other birds are usually deeper corollas and have higher amounts of nectar in them. And then flowers that are pollinated by ants and beetles and insects that don't have long mouth parts or long tongues are usually shallower where their nectar is and where their pollen is, so these insects can get to them pretty easily. Some pollinators are generalists, which means that one type of pollinator can take advantage of a huge amount of different types of flowers, and honeybees are an example of that. Honeybees will pollinate a wide variety of different flowering plants, including a lot of different crops. But some pollinators are very specialized, and so in these situations, some of these groups can be one group of bees that pollinate one group of flowers, and in some cases, one species of bee that pollinates only one species of flower. And this is an example with a lot of our orchid bees and orchids. And so what we see is, if you kind of look at an orchid through the vision of an insect, which don't see things the same way that we do, if you're kind of vaguely looking at these orchids, they kind of resemble a bee. But what's unique about these orchids is they'll even produce a chemical scent that's identical to that of the female bee's pheromone. So when the male bees are emerging, they're going to go to these flowers thinking they're female bees, try and mate with them. And as a result of that, they're going to get pollen on them. And then they're going to go to the next one, try to mate with that. And they pass on that pollen from flower to flower. So in this way, some of these flowers can trick these bees into visiting them and pollinating them. This was my kind of favorite story that tied in just my love for pollinators together. How many of you guys have heard of Darwin's star orchid? Anyone? Cool. This is my favorite story to tell. So when Charles Darwin was cataloging just biodiversity all around the world, he had samples from all over the world. He found this beautiful orchid that's from Madagascar, and he dissected it. And what he found was that the nectar of this flower was way down 12 inches deep in these little spurs at the base of these flowers. And from what he knew about pollinators, he hypothesized that there would have to be some sort of pollinator that can get to that source of nectar for this flower to continue to exist, or else why would insects keep coming to it? And so he tried to look for what this mystery pollinator might be, and he spent a long time, and he never found it, and then he eventually died. And it wasn't until decades later that scientists who were continuing to survey biodiversity found this insect. Yeah, so this is Darwin's hawk moth. And the cool thing about this moth is that its proboscis, which is kind of a straw-like structure that butterflies and moths have, was exactly the length to the millimeter of where that nectar source is in that flower. It's a very cool way to demonstrate how some of these relationships can be really important, where if we lose one part of that equation, we're going to lose more than just that insect. So these specific pollinators rely on these flowers, and these flowers specifically rely on these moths to continue to exist. So 80% of our plant species depend on pollinators to continue to exist. But out of those, bees are the most important pollinators. Any guesses as to why? What do you think makes bees so good at pollinating? You can yell it out.
Fuzz on their legs.
Pardon?
The fuzz on their legs.
Fuzzy. That's exactly it. Because they're fuzzy. Absolutely. So they have these hairs all over their body in different parts of their body. And that's what makes them so good at pollinating, because what's unique about them, we have hairs on our body. Lots of animals have hairs. But what's unique about bees is that these hairs are branched. And where these branched hairs are located on their body is dependent on the group of bees that you're looking at, and also makes them specifically better at pollinating certain types of flowers. And so if you look at these bees over here, if you look at the bee on the bottom left, where are those hairs located, do you think? Yeah, on the underside of the abdomen right there. How about the bee in the center? Yeah, on the legs. And then this bee on the right, that's a honeybee. They have a unique structure called a pollen basket or corbicula, where they'll pack in pollen, store it in there, and they also have a scraper built into one of their legs. When they get back to their hives, they'll scrape it out. And so they have all of these pollen pellets collected that they'll use to feed their growing larvae. So the first bee that we always think about are honeybees. They're the most famous bee of all, but they're not native to North America. They were brought here when settlers came in here in the 1600s. They brought their beehives and bee equipment with them because they couldn't part with their honey and their wax. But before that, we've had a wide variety of flowering plants, and we do have our own bees that have existed here. And so in the US alone, we have over 4,000 species of bees that are native to the US alone. And how many of you guys can name 40 different species of bees? Or 4 different species? Maybe after today, you can name 4 different groups of bees. So Montana specifically, we are home to between 500 and 750 different species of bees. And we also have the most bumblebee species of any state, with 28 species that are native to Montana, in addition to a couple other species that we've found occurring here that are from adjacent areas. And so it's a very cool, diverse place for bees because we have such a wide variety of different landscapes in Montana, which means just a wide variety of bees. So here are just a few of these groups of bees that I'm going to show you a little bit. Let's see, here are just so I'm going to show you these a little bit, but so the top left are bumblebees. They're easy to recognize. You can probably all spot a bumblebee. They're very large, very fuzzy, pretty charismatic. And we have a lot of them here in the state, and a lot of bumblebees are alpine specialists, which means that they can withstand colder temperatures than a lot of other bees. They can go up in higher elevations than other bees. They're the ones who are, in those mountain meadows up on top of these beautiful areas that we have in Montana. And also the bee found in the highest elevation in the world is a type of bumblebee that's found in the Himalayas. And so these bees can withstand some pretty rigorous conditions. Then we have our group of bees called mason bees and leafcutter bees. These are those common bees that if you have a little bee house or bee hotel, these are the most common bees that are living in those little tubes in those bee houses and bee hotels. And we'll learn a little bit more about them. Sweat bees. How many of you guys have experienced sweat bees? So if you're a gardener and you're out sweating, you might feel a little pinch on your skin and see a little shiny green bee on there. These bees are called sweat bees because they like to get the salts on our sweat from our skin. And so they'll kind of nibble on you as you're sweating in your garden and then, be on their way. Then we have mining bees. These are pretty common bees that nest in the ground. So they'll build these little tunnels in the ground. That's where they'll lay their eggs and have their larvae. And these are also very common pollinators of a lot of different orchards because in those bare spots under trees, there's a nice habitat for them. And they are out and about early in the season, so they're really good for the timing of pollinating these fruit crops. So bees are declining, and we've been seeing kind of trends of bee declines globally as well as in local areas. And there are a lot of different factors that are at play in terms of bee declines. Lots of things are contributing to this. That includes things like pollutants, things like pests and diseases, things like climate change, biodiversity loss overall. But two of the biggest factors that continue to pop up in a lot of these studies are things like pesticide use and habitat loss. And so out of those, habitat loss is one of the biggest factors contributing to the decline of pollinators, which makes sense. So even living in Montana, we're seeing kind of everything grow. Places that used to have, much smaller populations are expanding pretty quickly. We're seeing a lot more urbanization, more neighborhoods built in areas that were wild spaces. And this is happening all over the world. And so that means less habitat for organisms like bees to call home. In addition to that, certain pest management practices can also impact bee populations in ways that can outright kill those bees, so lethal effects, or can impact the health of those bees in different ways, which are called sublethal effects. And so a lot of times, this also has to do with kind of improper pest management practices or improper use of pesticides that people who don't know what they're doing often accidentally are using products that are impacting these beneficial organisms in negative ways. So what can we do about this now that we know what's going on? There are a few things that home gardeners or people who have their own little spaces to manage can do to help pollinators, and every little bit does impact bees and does count. So what do bees need? Bees need three main things. They need food, they need a place to live, and they need safety or protection, in this case, protection from pesticides. So these kind of three main factors are similar to what we need: something to eat, a place to live, and safety. And so we're going to talk about food and nesting habitat together and we're going to call this bee habitat because habitat is a place where you can find a place to live and food to eat in the same location. So a little bit about bee ecology. Bees are central place foragers, which means they will have one nest location and they'll go out a certain distance away from that nest to collect all the resources that they need, all the food, all the kind of nesting materials, and then they'll come back to that nest. And so the amount of distance they can go away from their nests can vary depending on the type of bee that you're looking at, and can be anywhere from a few miles for some of these larger bee species, all the way to a couple 100 feet for some of these smaller species. So it's really important to have these ideal habitats where you have both the food and nesting areas in close proximity to each other, because not all of these groups of bees can go far enough away to collect all those resources. So ideally, we have all these nesting sites which contain all of these components, and I'm going to talk about those in a second, as well as floral resources that continue to overlap in this perfect section of the Venn diagram, where you have both of these available in close proximity, which makes it that ideal bee habitat. So in terms of food, I'm not going to talk about specific flowering plants because there are hundreds and hundreds of them, but I'm going to show you where you go to access that information. So we have a lot of different resources available that are specific to Montana, Montana native flowers and flowers that are hardy in Montana climates. And these are publications including the Xerces Society, which has a lot of great plant lists for different climates. They also have Pollinator Partnership also put together a really nice publication about this. And the cool thing about these two publications is they have these organized based on when these flowers bloom. So you can kind of map out your calendar in terms of making sure that there's something flowering throughout that growing season. We also have fact sheets from a lot of university institutions that have come up with kind of ideal kind of flower types for pollinators. And so there are a lot of places where you can access these resources. And if you want specific links to more of these, please feel free to send me an email and I'll send you more. But you can find this information pretty readily. And one of the best places to go for more of this information is your local extension offices or your local conservation districts, because they can access this information and get you kind of more localized lists. So a few things to focus on when we are talking about plants for pollinators. You want to think about a few things that make this easier for bees. The first thing is food proximity, making sure that the food sources available to bees are in close proximity to places where these bees can live, so they don't have to travel as far to get to them. Secondly, we also want to aim for food diversity. So we want to have a wide variety of different flowering plants, because we learned that a lot of our pollinators can be specialists, which means certain groups of flowers are going to be attracting certain groups of bees. And so having just the widest variety of flowering plants available means that you're going to cater to the widest diversity of different pollinators, including bees. Food succession is also really important, because a lot of times when we're thinking about our gardens, we're planting things that are blooming around the same time, but ideally we want something that's flowering throughout this growing season, and especially early in the season and late in the season. Those are the most important ones, because that's when there are the fewest resources available for bees. So making sure you have something that's flowering early in the season like now, and something that's going to continue to flower into October, when those last kind of queen bumblebees are getting ready to overwinter, to be able to survive that winter and then build their nests the following years. Other things to consider are you want to select from a wide variety of resources. So kind of check different resources, because you might find kind of different types of plants available. And then you also want to do some research to figure out when those plants are going to bloom, so you can plan it out in your calendar and have that kind of set and organized in a way that you have something that's flowering throughout that growing season. You want to mix a wide variety of plants, different colors, textures, shapes, sizes, different features in them to attract the widest variety of pollinators. And then avoid flowers that have really complicated anatomy, like double petal flowers, because a lot of times those are a waste of energy for bees to get to that source of nectar and pollen within those flowers. Other things to consider, so if you're looking at trees and shrubs, in terms of their footprint size, it's small, but in terms of just the amount of flowers they pack into one plant is pretty big. So you get a lot of bang for your buck if you're planting trees and shrubs, flowering trees and shrubs that are good for pollinators. In addition, perennials are better than annual plants for pollinators. A lot of our research has shown that more pollinators will visit perennial flowers than annual ones. And although native plants are a really great part of our landscapes because our native pollinators evolved with these plants, these are the plants that they've been feeding on. And there are also a lot of these specialized associations between native plants and native pollinators. But it doesn't only have to be native plants. A lot of our non-native plants, a lot of our woody ornamental species, and other kind of nice flowering non-native plants can also be really great nutritious sources of nectar and pollen for bees. And so research has shown that lots of different types of pollinators, including native pollinators, will visit non-native plants. And there have been differences in composition of the different types of bees that visit these non-native versus native plants. So having just a mix of all these kinds of plants is the best way to have the best kind of source of food for bees. So now we're going to talk about nesting habitat. So in terms of nesting habitat, there are a few things to keep in mind in terms of what bees need, but a few kind of just a general overview of how bees nest. There are two main types of nesting behaviors that bees have. And most bee species, about 70% of them, nest below ground, usually in cavities that they'll drill themselves or tunnel out themselves, but some of them will nest in old rodent burrows and abandoned kind of areas within the soil. The rest of the bees, about 30%, are above ground nesters, which will nest in cavities that exist above ground, usually kind of in old burrows, old twigs and brambles, things like that. Those are kind of commonly what they have been found to nest in. So if you're a pollinator and you're looking at these places that are becoming more and more urbanized, where the green spaces are becoming further and further apart, it becomes more challenging to find a place where you can live in these areas or to find food if you have found a place to live. So in terms of places to live, when you're talking about ground nesting bees, it's pretty simple. You basically just want to give them access to what they need as a nesting site. So in this picture, there are a few things wrong. But if you're a bee and you're looking at this picture, what are some of the things that you see that are wrong?
Ground cover under the plants.
Yeah, there's mulch. Yeah, it's just covered in mulch. What else?
No diversity in the grass.
There's no diversity in the grass. There is nothing flowering either. There's not a flower in this garden. And so there are a few things. There's no food. There's no available nesting site. And so for ground nesting bees, just leave bare soil for bees. And it doesn't mean leave your entire yard just with bare dirt all over. Make sure that you have certain sections out of the way spaces. Yeah, you don't want to bring in those noxious weeds from, getting in there and taking hold. But leave some areas mulch-free, leave some bare patches, it could be behind your trees and shrubs, and leave them in out-of-the-way areas, undisturbed areas where you're not going to be walking around or digging in there. But leave these out-of-the-way areas with bare soil, which gives bees access to that nesting resource. For these cavity nesting bee species, these above-ground bees, we can get a little bit more detailed. But one of the best things to do is to mimic what's found in nature by leaving your yards and gardens a little bit wild. So not doing that really intense garden cleanup that a lot of us kind of feel tempted to do after the end of the season, cutting everything down. So a few things to keep in your landscapes are a couple of old wooden stumps that might have some kind of rotting sections with little holes in them. Leave your hollow stem grasses up a little bit longer. If you have woody stems and twigs, cut them at varying heights from 6 to 18 inches at different levels. So if you have raspberry specifically, they have this kind of pithy inside that bees will chew out and build nests in. And so don't cut those back, those canes that are spent from the past year. Don't cut them back right away. Leave them at varying heights so nesting bees can use that as a place to build their nests. And then leaf litter. Don't clean up all of your leaf litter. Take sections of it. Yeah. Yes, exactly. Some of you are realizing, exactly. Some of you are realizing that we've been helping pollinators this whole time, right? Exactly. See, now you're justified. Yep. I'm a lazy gardener. Being a lazy gardener, I'm justified. I'm doing all the right things. But leaf litter is really important because that is where a lot of our bumblebees, our queen bumblebees nest. They nest in leaf litter. And so those queen bumblebees need that nesting site going into the winter before they come out in the spring and build those nests. So if you don't have the amount of space to be able to do this, some people don't, then you can also build artificial nesting sites for these cavity nesting bees. And there's just a huge variety of different types of these nesting materials available, but we'll talk about what some of the best ones to use are. So here are examples of, this is one nesting block, and then these are 4 different types of bees that are nesting in the same nesting block. So the top row, those bees are going to fill the insides of these little tubes with cut leaves. These are our leaf cutter bees, so you might see little perfect round notches cut out of some of your leaves of your flowers. Yeah, so these are your leaf cutter bees. They're a great pollinator. They're also important for our alfalfa industry because they are the ones that pollinate our alfalfa crop, and that's how we get our alfalfa seed. The second row, we have these their larvae sectioned off with these resin or cellophane-like partitions, and these are resin bees. And so these bees will take plant saps and they'll create little partitions in between their larvae and section them off with plant saps. Then below them, these bees will use mud to section off their different larvae. And so these are our mason bees. They'll go collect bare soil, usually soils that are high in clay, which we don't have any of in Montana, right? We have, so really great soil for these mason bees here, which will collect those clay soils and partition their nests with those. And then at the bottom, we have bees that will collect plant hairs. So from plants that have really kind of fuzzy foliage, like lamb's ears or rosy pussy toes, those plants that have the fuzz, these bees will cut that fuzz off and use them to kind of protect their larvae as they're nesting. And so these are called our wool carder bees. Other nesting materials that we want to incorporate in these kind of bee hotels or bee boxes are things like hollow tubes, ideally made of cardboard or bamboo, or other kind of hollow woody twigs that you might have in your landscape, or drilled wooden blocks made of untreated wood that are about 4 to 8 inches deep with closed on one end, and bundles of twigs and bundles of pith that are kind of squeezed together or tied up with twine, where bees will nest in between those little crevices. Yes.
On the drilled wood, how big a hole are you talking?
I'm about to tell you.
Oh, okay.
Good question. So you can make these yourself if you're handy, if you have a little kind of shop, or if you have, ideally you need a drill press to do this. I'm not very handy, so I buy mine. But if you're drilling your own bee hotel, this, I'm going to show you this. This is a publication from Nebraska. So if you really want these specifications, Google Nebraska Extension Bee Hotel, and you'll find a 4-page document that goes into the very details of the exact measurements in millimeters of the diameter of those nesting holes, as well as the types of bees that are attracted to those different sizes of holes. So if you're really interested, but these holes range between 3/32 of millimeter, about 2.4 millimeters, so 3/32 of an inch, all the way up to about 3/8 of an inch for most bees. They will nest up to a 1/2 inch, but most of the time 3/8 of an inch is probably the most common size of these bee boxes, because that's where our mason bees and our leaf cutter bees are nesting in.
And so if you do this, does it have to be like a new piece of wood every year? Are they using the
So ideally, we want to clean these out every year or give them a new block every year. So what I do is if I have a wooden block, I'll use it in my wood pile that winter and then start with a new one. So what I'll do is I'll line it with kind of paper so that I can just pull those bees out of those paper tubes, store them in kind of a shed where they're going to be safe and in the cool weather, and then set them back out in the spring where they'll emerge, but I'll set out a fresh new block for them in the spring. So
Wait,
that...
Say it again, you're pulling the bees out of the hole?
Yes.
In what month?
So that's, okay, good question. And I'll talk about that in just a second, but let's finish talking about this. So I'll talk about that in just a second. Remind me if I don't. So in terms of the depth is also really important. So you want these to be at about 4 to 6 inches deep, but at least 4 inches deep, because some of these bee species, like our blue orchard bee, these bees will plan whether they're laying male or female eggs based on where they're located within that tube. And so because males are usually more expendable, because the females are the ones that are laying the eggs, doing all the work, making the nest, doing everything, and the males are only there for mating. They'll lay the male eggs right at the entrance and the female eggs inside those tubes. And so if a couple of birds get to a couple of those right at the beginning, you're not losing too much in terms of your investment. Yeah. Yeah. So you're not losing too much in terms of your investment. And so if you have only a 3-inch deep one, you might have way more males than females, which will impact the kind of proportions of male and female bees in those populations. So now this is the publication where you can get more information about it. After I talk through all these, then I will talk about kind of the management of these and how to take out those bees and what to do. But that can be an entirely different class too, because ideally when you have these bee hotels or bee boxes, you want to make sure that you're not creating a situation where you're building up populations of pests and diseases, because we're kind of housing them in close conditions, like unnaturally close quarters, and so pests and disease populations can start to build up. And so depending on the type of nesting tubes you have, so let's say you have straws that you put, cardboard or bamboo straws, I'll remove just those straws and then put them in a mesh bag and put them in a refrigerator or put them in a garage that's not insulated and leave them in there. So I'll take them out at the end of the growing season. So when the first kind of snow starts to hit, that's when I'll take those out of there, because that's when all the bees are done filling in whatever they wanted to in there. That's when I'll take that nesting block off and take out those bees, keep them in a safe spot, and then I will set them back out in the spring when temperatures warm up to about 55 degrees for about 4 or 5 days straight. That's when they start to emerge and look for food to eat, but you also want to make sure that there are things that are flowering for them to feed on at that time. So make sure that your flower garden is starting to bloom as well when you set them out. So, and then you can clean those blocks if you have. You can set them out in these little, you can make a little kind of structure, so a little box with a lid, and cut a little hole, a 1/2-inch hole in there, and leave them in the dark so they're protected. And eventually, as they start to hatch, when those temperatures, that'll give them the signal to hatch, they'll slowly walk towards the light, crawl out, and fly out of there one at a time. So keep them in a kind of little shoebox or something like that, in a cute little structure. Or you can just, if you have tied these up in a twine with your kind of tubes, you can just set up that set of tubes in front of, just set it in like just a coffee can or something protected, so, a hungry squirrel isn't going to come and eat all of those little helpless bees. Set it in just a little section where they'll just slowly start to emerge out. So you can set up your whole bundle of your bee tubes together, and they'll eventually hatch out and come out of there. But what you don't want to do is have them use the same tubes over and over and over again, where that's where they'll build up those pests and diseases.
Wait for what you forget.
So if you take a block of wood and build all these holes, you have these tubes that go in it, right?
Yeah, so if you have,
So once you pull the tube, you
Wow.
can use that block.
yes, you can just put another tube in there. Yeah. So if you have a wooden block that you've drilled into, just take a piece of paper, cut it, roll it, stick it in there, take that paper out, put in a new paper next year.
Can you just take the block and put it in a plastic container?
You don't want to close that plastic container as long as it has air holes or something so they get some sort of ventilation. But yes, you can do that. You can put it away and then put a new block out if you want to, exactly, whatever you'd rather do. But the important point of this is that it's not a no maintenance situation. You do need to take some steps to make sure that you're not creating a hazard for bees if you are setting out these bee boxes. There are also a few things that you don't want to do in terms of bee boxes and if you're building them. So make sure that you're paying attention to the diameter and the depth of these holes. So a lot of times if you're buying these, you might see ones that are really shallow or really narrow, which are basically just like decorations, and they're not going to be very useful for bees. You also want to make sure that you drill them evenly, don't have any kind of jagged edges or kind of pokey things sticking out, because you don't want the bee to get shish kebabbed on her way into that nest. And then you also don't want to use any sort of treated or painted wood materials, so make sure that you are using untreated wood. You can also buy your own bee hotel materials if you don't have a drill press or don't have a wood shop or someone who can make these for you. And there are just a huge variety of these available that look really cool and interesting, and there's lots of different unique designs and features of these available. And so there's lots of different things you can buy that would make things easy for you. But there are a few things that you want to think about when you're buying these in terms of what not to buy. You want to minimize the use of plastic for nesting materials. So for those tubes, you don't want to use plastic straws because it'll limit kind of moisture within there. It'll limit that oxygen exchange, which is not good for the bees. You also don't want to purchase ones that are really shallow or have really too wide of those tubes that bees aren't just going to use. They're just going to sit there. And so that one in the middle is an example of one. I found one for sale online and I bought it, but it was only a front view. And then when I got it in the mail, it was about 1 inch deep. And so that's, you know, like a read those measurements kind of a lesson that I learned from that. And then you also want to pay attention to color and material. You don't want them to be kind of painted all black where you know, if you have like a really hot sunny day and they're out in the open, you don't want to cook those little bee larvae in there. And then we need to think about where to put these, which is also important. So you want these to be about 3 to 5 feet above the ground, so at approximately eye level. And you want bees to have access to that early morning sun because they're cold-blooded. They need external heat to be able to warm up and get going. And so having them faced in the southeastern direction is the best because they get access to that early morning sunshine so they can get going and, you know, get on their way to collect all of those resources that they need to fill in their nests. You also want these somewhat sheltered, so under an overhang or something, so that water isn't going to collect in them and kind of sit there in a puddle. You don't need to worry about making them waterproof because these bees are automatically waterproof. They've been surviving in nature long before we've been building these little boxes for them. And you also don't want them to be easily knocked over, so have them in a secure spot where they're not going to sway or just get toppled over or drop to the ground. And away from foot traffic and predators that are going to, you know, find a nice meal out of this.
So the southeastern direction is when they're coming out of the
Yes, yeah. So that's the direction that the tubes should be facing.
That's when you're releasing?
That's where you just set them. That's where your bee hotel sits all season long. Okay. Yeah. So then bees that are working in the morning, they're going to hunker down in there at night. And then in the morning, when that first rays of sunshine start to hit, they can get going right away and collect all the stuff that they need.
Going to act as a hive then?
Kind of, but these bees are solitary, so they're not working together. They each are managing their own nest, so they're not working together. They don't produce honey or anything. They're just each finding a little spot to nest in those little tubes.
Okay.
Yeah. So there are a few things that you want to keep in mind in terms of where not to put these. So you want to avoid areas where predators can have easy access to them. So the picture on the left that you see is actually something I found available for sale online. It's a birdhouse bee hotel in one, which is basically a bed and breakfast. Yeah, for your birds. Yeah, it's like a B&B. So yeah, you go in there, you find a place to nest, you grab some breakfast to go, and you know, you're good. So this is not great for bees. Might be really awesome for the birds that nest in there, but not a great spot to put your bee hotels. You also don't want to put them next to any kind of feeders. If you have bird feeders around, don't put them next to those. And then you don't want to put them in areas where you have kind of just like a water spout or something like that, right under a rain gutter where water is going to collect in there. And don't want to put them right in front of where you're going to be walking around a lot because these bees are so busy, they're just doing what they're doing. You might just get hit in the head by a few bees that are, slightly more confused than you as to what happened as you're kind of walking past. So if you sit there long enough in front of these kind of structures and bees are busy visiting, you might get hit in the head by a bee and she'll be, a little bit frazzled as well. So then we want to think about protection from pesticides. So a lot of our pesticide use in home gardens is for aesthetic reasons and not necessarily always for the health of our plants, but more so because of issues that we don't like to see on our plants. So most of the critters, though, in our landscapes, including these native bees and other all of these kind of insects that we see, a lot of these critters are also beneficial. So they're providing some sort of a service by eating the other kind of pest type critters in your landscape, helping create a balance of that ecosystem. And they're just kind of part of these ecosystems that exist in our landscapes. So when we use insecticides that aren't targeting specific organisms, so when we use broad spectrum insecticides, we're not just targeting the ones that we want to get rid of, we're also impacting these other organisms that are important parts of our landscape. So how do we manage pests safely? We think about IPM, or integrated pest management. And this is probably something that's familiar to you guys. You've probably heard IPM before. But this is kind of like the food pyramid of IPM or of pest management, where the bottom section, which is the largest section, should be your main focus. And so start with preventing pest problems and then moving your way up those rungs. And finally, if you've exhausted your options and none of those have worked, then you do resort to chemical control strategies. And so the first thing you want to think about is know when to spray, if you need to spray, and if that situation can be managed in other ways. Can you prevent those pests from accessing your veggie garden using kind of row covers or protecting cloths, or monitoring them using sticky trap, pruning out those critters, or helping encourage beneficial organisms in your landscape like lady beetles and lacewings from eating those critters in our landscape. But if these strategies don't work, then we want to think about how to safeguard bees when we're using insecticides in our landscape. So the first step of safely using our pesticides in general is to follow label precautions. And so reading and following those label precautions entirely, because the label is the law. So in 2013, the EPA came out with this bee hazard label, which is a diamond-shaped symbol with a bee in it that indicates if a product is negatively impacting bees, or if a product has components in it that can harm bees. And so you can look for this symbol on your pesticide label when you're selecting pesticides. You also want to avoid overspraying any plants that are currently flowering. So if you have any plants that are currently flowering, wait until after they are done flowering, or remove those flowers if you are going to need to apply an insecticide on these plants. You can also think of different types of formulations. So in lawns, if you have like a weed and feed that you put in your lawn, you can get a spray formulation or a granular formulation. But research that was done in our lab in University of Kentucky showed that if you use spray formulations and you have lawn weeds in your lawn, then the pollinators visiting those lawn weeds were negatively impacted. But if you used a granular application and then wetted it down, those pollinators were not negatively impacted by that product. We also use a lot of systemic insecticides, which a lot of our neonicotinoid products, for example, which are used for controlling a lot of common pests that are really hard to get to, like scale insects and stuff, that are protected or they're within structures that we can't easily access with sprays. And so systemic insecticides are basically insecticides that you either inject in a plant or apply at the base of the plant, but it'll be taken up throughout the tissues of that plant and spread out throughout that tissue. And so these also will spread to the nectar and pollen of those plants when they flower. And so this transfer of this insecticide can negatively impact bees through passing on to those flowers. And so this was another study that was done in my lab at University of Kentucky, where we were looking at the timing of application and thinking about whether or not if we timed it to be a certain time period, if that would reduce the amount of insecticide present in that nectar and pollen in those flowers. And what we found was we did 3 kind of time periods. We did a spring just before those plants flowered. We did an early summer, which is right after those plants were done flowering. And we did a fall application and then looked at the following year's spring flowers. And what we found was that in the spring, just before they flower, or in the fall, before the next year's flowers, the concentrations of these insecticides were high enough that they were known to be negatively impacting bees. So they exceeded the concentrations that have been shown to result in negative impacts for bees. But when we did that right after they were done flowering application, the following year's blooms for one product, for imidacloprid product specifically, had a concentration low enough that it would not negatively impact bees. And so thinking about using a product like that and making sure that you're applying it right after they're done flowering so that you don't have that residue in the nectar and pollen of your flowering trees and shrubs. So this kind of showed how we can change our timing to reduce the impact. If we do end up using a product at a different time, sometimes we need to use them at certain times, then you want to mow or prune off anything that was sprayed. So if you are applying something in your lawn to get rid of a certain type of pest or getting rid of weeds, mow your lawn to get rid of those flowering lawn weeds so you're not creating that hazard for bees as a contaminated source of flowers. And you also want to choose products that are relatively non-hazardous for bees, and this is where it gets a little bit more difficult, but a few things to keep in mind is that just because something is marketed as natural does not mean that it is safe, and just because it is an organic product does not mean that it is safer than a synthetic or conventional product. So those are the 2 most important things to keep in mind. There are a lot of natural things in the world like ricin and cyanide that are not really good. And so just using that terminology isn't a good guideline, but aiming for products that have less residual, so don't stick around in the environment for long periods of time, is a good way to help minimize the impact. And again, read and follow those label directions. In terms of weed management in bees, weed problems are usually common in lawns that aren't healthy. And so healthy lawns can often outcompete weeds. But if you have a patchy or unhealthy lawn, that's where weeds are going to infiltrate that lawn system. And so if you're looking at your lawn, think about those flowering plants in your lawn. Are they weeds? Do you need to get rid of them? And what the safest way to get rid of them is. But a lot of flowering lawn weeds can be an important source of food for pollinators. So this was another study done at the University of Kentucky in my lab where we found 37 species of bees that were foraging on lawn weeds, including clover and dandelion. And out of those lawn weeds, clover is a really good source of food for bees, especially bumblebees. But lawn weeds can act as these stepping stones between remnants of natural habitat. So in areas where you have kind of more urban areas, everywhere has a lawn pretty much, and most lawns have these weeds. So these weeds can be a little source of food and connect those natural areas. And so what can you do to help pollinators? Think of the level of lawn excellence you want to maintain. Don't do this on the bottom right or the top right. There are bigger issues at play here. But consider if you have a few flowering kind of clover patches in your lawn, if it's fine to just leave it that way. Lawns can also offer a unique opportunity because they're very common in our landscapes. Lawns are as American as apple pie, pretty much. But they can create this opportunity for creating more pollinator habitat. So you can think about, if you're not using your lawn for functional purposes, think about a ground cover that will again replace that vegetation within your lawn, but also provide a source of food like flowers for pollinators. In addition, there are also things called bee lawns where you can incorporate turf grass within low-growing flowering plants and have it be a multi-purpose lawn where you can still use it to let your dog out and kind of walk around. But you can also have that dual purpose of having that food for bees incorporated within it. And so University of Minnesota has shown that over 50 species of bees use these flowers in bee lawns as a source of food, But important thing to keep in mind for bee lawns is that they don't stand up to heavy wear and tear. So they won't function in athletic situations or in recreational situations where you're heavily using that turf. But in terms of turf grass types, the best ones to use are fine fescues. And these are just a few examples of the type of low-growing flowering plants that you can incorporate. So Dutch white clover, creeping thyme, self-heal, and common violet. And here's just examples of what some of these bee lawns look like. And they can be very beautiful and add a little bit of color to your lawns. Other things that you can do, you don't have to go all out and create acres of pollinator habitat right away. Creating small sections of it in wherever you can in your landscape is still going to have a positive impact on pollinators. And so you can create these little pollinator patches around your landscape. And then in a lot of areas within Montana and all over, we have HOAs to deal with. And so you can't just have kind of a wild garden in the front of your yard. And so for that kind of a situation, something like a mullet garden could be a good kind of solution. Yeah, where you have your business in the front, your nice, perfectly manicured landscape, and then your pollinator party in the back, where you kind of left your landscape a little wild with those flowers and things like that growing. So yeah, have it be kind of the best of both worlds. So if you want more information on these, there's just a variety of places that you can get these. And that includes, we have a pollinator health center at MSU, as well as NRCS and ARS have a lot of good pollinator information. Xerces Society and Pollinator Partnership also have a lot of those flowering publications. And then your local extension offices and conservation districts, which can also connect you to all of these resources and more localized resources for you when it comes to pollinators. And that is everything that I had. If you're interested in getting this slide to get these links, you can just let Ben know and I can send him this slide so that you can have these so you don't need to hurry and copy them all down. But that is everything that I had. Any questions?
So, how far will bees travel to pollinate? Because some of us have a neighbor about a half mile away who gets bees put next to his house every year.
Yeah, so bees will, depending on the type of bee, they will travel anywhere from a few hundred feet. So if they're smaller bees, they will only travel a couple hundred feet. But some bees, like honeybees, can travel over 3 miles in distance to pollinate.
So do we know what those are when they come to your house? I mean, I know that they're from some bee company that are making.
Yeah, Hamilton. Yeah, they've got a lot of my place.
Yeah, so those bees can travel miles. Honeybees can travel miles.
I have a question about,
Yeah.
we have an abundance of yellow jackets on our house that have been there for 100 years, I swear. And I just can't kill them off. Will they affect the bee hotels if we were to put them up?
That's a good question, and the answer to that is no. Yellow jackets will not use those bee hotels. They will not impact those. They won't really mess with the bees in there. So no.
Then how do I kill the yellow jackets and not kill the bees?
By safely using products away from flowering plants that are labeled for yellow jackets. So you can get wasp sprays that shoot like a long distance. And so you can also get products that you can apply at the base of the nest. So kind of scout the area where you're seeing them. See if you can't spot where they're going down to find their nest, because yellow jackets will nest below ground. So there will be some sort of an entrance.
Ours are nesting in our house, in the walls.
So that's challenging. You're going to need to get some sort of an insecticide to those yellow jackets.
So those wasp traps, do those affect bees? I mean, bees go in there and die too?
That's a good question. So if you put up a yellow jacket trap that's specifically labeled yellow jacket traps, they have a pheromone included in there that's heptylbutynate, and that pheromone will only attract yellow jackets.
Okay.
That will not attract bees. So putting out those wasp traps are another good thing, because especially like putting them out early season, like now, you want to catch those queens before they build new nests.
Yes.
So do yellow jackets pollinate?
Yes. So it's complicated, but yes, because they still visit flowers and they still consume nectar, they will go on flowers and go to different flowers and will still pollinate, but they're not as efficient in terms of pollinating. There are also natural predators of a lot of other pest insects. And so they have positive functions in the ecosystem, but when they're in our houses or right next to where we're kind of picnicking or where a playground is, then they can be aggressive and they can be dangerous. And so, yeah, they can cause a lot of problems.
So what about water? You didn't mention water.
I didn't mention water. Most of the time, bees will get all of their moisture needs from nectar, but a lot of times in natural areas, just the dew that collects is enough water. But if you live in a more urbanized space, I would say have a little kind of little water receptacle. Make sure if you are putting that water out, you clean it out regularly and you have pebbles or marbles or something at the base so the bees don't drown when they're trying to access that water. Water is more important for honeybees than it is for these native bees because they will use the water to cool their hives. Native bees will sometimes use a little bit of moisture to create those like mud partitions like mason bees do, but most of the moisture they get from nectar. Any other questions?
So there's bat hotels too, right?
I've seen those bat hotels. I don't know that much about them.
There's butterfly houses.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can get butterfly houses too, yeah.
And so ladybug houses, I've seen them too.
So those are, I don't know very much about those, but from what I've seen, those are are those the ones people are buying with ladybugs in them to release, or are they?
Well, I've seen them where they look much like the bee houses, smaller areas maybe, and then you buy the ladybugs separate. And
Oh, okay. So, interesting. Yeah, I don't have much experience with those.
Ladybugs aren't needed, right?
Exactly. So ideally, you don't want to bring in non-native critters. And also, if you are buying kind of biocontrol critters like lady beetles or even, mantids and stuff and releasing them, they're just going to go away. They're not going to stick around where you want them to. They're going to go wherever they want to go. So the best thing to have those kind of beneficial insects that are going to eat those pests is to create a nice habitat that's safe from these negative practices that can harm them. All right. Well, thanks so much, everyone. Thank you.